Hello, this is Neo, just an average CSGO player, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel.
Right, this is going to be another episode of Reflections, and my guest for this one is going to be Jason Lake. Here's the first place we will start, because no one ever brings this up anymore, is you did once have an alias. It was, probably by definition, the worst boomer alias ever, because it wasn't even one, it was the number one. So you have to realize, Jason, you can't even Google that, bro. Like what do you even find? So one, why did you pick that? Two, why did you drop it? Why don't you use an alias anymore? Why is it just Jason Lake now?
Man, I was just playing Counter-Strike back in the day, and I had I had J Lake, and I had a couple different things, and finally I just settled on the number one. So it was COL.1, and it was just like, I'm in this to be number one. I want to be number one. Okay. I'm incredibly competitive, and I don't know, just one day I popped it up there. I guess it stuck for a while. I still use it in some different games, but yeah, man, that's a throwback. I haven't used that for a long time.
When you first came into the scene, we'll get in a second to some of the things of like getting big name players to get attention for the team and carry the team a little bit. But before that, the question I would ask is this, because I remember when you came in and you made like the big statements, the bombastic things that got the attention. One thing no one ever asked you, and I always got this undertone, was the reason you liked that, and this must have made you quite unique, is you were actually a real fan of CS and you were someone who played CS. So to you, I'm guessing it was cool, the idea of if we could compete at a higher level, or fuck, we could actually get like a pro player to play in my team, or of what we can compete with Team 3D. That was a big deal to you. You weren't actually like, I think people thought maybe you were an outsider coming in who didn't know the space. To me, it's the opposite. You were actually like, you were kind of getting off. It was a thrill to be able to compete and have real players, right?
No, absolutely. I loved Counter-Strike. I'd grown up a gamer, like all the way back to arcades and Atari 2600. So when I first discovered Counter-Strike, this was like when the internet was a brand new thing. I'm really aging myself here. I remember when I got my first DSL line in my office, I would stay at my office to play Counter-Strike because the connection was so much better. Because I started playing Counter-Strike on dial-up, where you heard the phone going, and all that. So no, I was a gamer myself, and extremely competitive type of person. And I started Complexity because the teams I was just messing around playing on, people wouldn't show up for practices, and it just pissed me off, and I wanted to do it, more professionally. And then it just kept scaling. I just kept hiring better and better, and then I incorporated the company, and I really admired what Team 3D had built at that time. So I'm like, well, I'm going to build something better, and we're going to go out and kick their ass. So that was the goal from day one, and I put my money where my mouth was. Before CGS, I think I'd invested like $500,000 of my own money to build up Complexity. And this is in the early 2000s. $500,000 was a lot more money than it is now.
And for esports, that's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, at the time, people that cared about me thought I was losing my mind. They're like, what is this? And I'm like, I really believed, and I've stuck by this mantra for many years. Esports is a digital sport for a new digital era. And I saw my opportunity, to own a professional sports franchise. For the average person, owning the Cowboys, the Yankees, the Lakers, whatever, it's less likely probably than winning the lottery at this point. But when I saw what I believed to be a new sport rising, I wanted to build a great brand and own a sports franchise in that new sport. And that's where we kicked off way back in the day.
As much as people can have their own opinions on some of the other things you did in the early day, the thing I just alluded to, which is actually the first place I ever heard of Complexity, which was when you actually figured out sort of a loophole others hadn't thought of, which was, at the time, people's perspective on esports is you wait until you're a top team, then you sign the best players, they're the most famous players, that's how you get your fame. And what you did in the early days was when this team was nobody and was just competing, I think it was in Cal, or it was Cal Main back then, was it? When you used to compete in the Cal, just the online amateur leagues, basically, you realised, well, people like, and it was famously the NOA team, because they were like half European, half North, they didn't play in Cal Invite, they didn't play any of the online leagues, so they weren't like unable to play elsewhere. So you realise you could just get people like Knoxville from NOA. There was a few other Europeans. You could basically just pay a European and tell him, look, you're not doing anything anyway for the next 2 months. Just ring from our team. Just come and play a low-level game. Look, we're not playing like the CPL or whatever yet. We're just playing it. And even though at the time people saw that as a gimmick, like I say, they saw it as you're almost like a vanity project. Like you want to play with Knoxville, so you pay him to come play. That actually did instantly, I'm not joking, raise the profile of Call like a millionfold. Like I remember back then, fans who didn't even know it was a stunt were sort of thinking like, oh, who are they going to sign next? And look, the joke is a couple of years later, you did end up with a proper professional team of good players that became champions. But at the time, it was kind of just like where did this idea come from? You just knew one of the players or something? It's kind of a wild idea to just pay someone to come and play, right?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted the best. I wanted to make a splash. I wanted to make a statement, and I wanted to win. And Knoxville at the time was one of the greatest in-game minds anywhere in the world. So, yeah, we played with him, and he played some matches from Europe and everything else. And I also, shortly after Bullseye retired from Team 3D, I found out he lived in Atlanta, and I lived in Atlanta at the time. So I convinced him to come over to my house, gave him a bunch of beer, and so what's it going to take? You're going to come play for me. He's like, oh, I'm done. I'm like, you're not done. What's it going to take? And I ended up buying him a motorcycle, a crotch rocket to join Complexity, and that's why he's in some of those early videos playing for the team. And at the time, I was just kind of trying to figure it out. I wanted to make a lot of noise, and I wanted to get the absolute best players that I could. And the system was not like it is today, where there's analysts and statistics. You can go to websites and pull down all kinds of information about players and their history. It was obviously, it was nothing like that. So you were shooting from the hip much more. How can I get people that can get us a trophy? How can I get them to join the org? And yeah, that's kind of what led to those two.
On that one, I also do want to ask about that one, because that was essentially a giant signing. I mean, it's hard to even think of a spot.
It was like,
yeah, it was huge. Yeah, because if people don't realise, the reason why that was also actually a very shrewd signing, even though he only played for like a year or whatever, is because that was an example of a player where, because there wasn't still that much money in esports, because he couldn't be on the absolute best team, it's not like normal sports where, the second best team says pretty good salary. He realised, well, I'm not really going to make a living salary, I'll just retire then. But actually it meant he still had a bit of like gas left in the tank. And crucially, you get a player like that. It's funny because people will forget this. The first CPL with him was the one with the scoffed line before fRoD and all those guys. So that was the one where it wasn't a very good result. So at the time, actually, a lot of the furore I remember was people mocking Cole. They were like, look, they've overpaid Bullseye, who's like at the end of his career. They haven't got a team. If you remember, the reason why, I'm sure you called it Call Redemption for the winter one, is all the memes in the community were the team's going to come. I think people even used to do a joke like road to 22nd place at CPL or whatever, all the fucking jokes like that. Like, basically, this was another step along the way to having a functional team, right? When you get a player like that, you can then get other Cal Invite level players. There's a reason they know it's for real at that point, right?
100%. Like at that time, Team 3D was Team USA. So me coming in big, bold, and brash and saying, we're going to be the new top dog, just put a giant target on our back. But, I guess what's the old saying is, there's no good press, bad press, as long as you get press, as long as people are talking about you. And everybody was talking about it. Oh, for
sure.
And in the movie Complexity Redemption, we captured this a little bit, showing the forums, just like they're terrible. And then, of course, by the end of the movie, everyone's like, oh, wow, they're good.
Yes.
So the Bullseye signing was huge on multiple levels, because, not just from increasing our talent and slowly scaling up how good the actual team was, but from an optics standpoint, it was like, this guy just left 3D. He's moving on with his life. No, he's not. He's going to play for Complexity. And at that time, it was a massive, massive statement move. And yeah, I've seen him over the years a couple times, and we still laugh about that motorcycle. He's a great guy, and yeah, your memory never ceases to amaze me, man. Like you remember things about Complexity that I don't sometimes. You're like an encyclopedia of esports.
Well, dude, there's actually on that particular signing,
like, holy shit.
A lot of people won't remember this, but another thing you actually did when you signed him, because as you say, you lived in the same area, is you did it like signing a professional football player. You had like literally him sat doing the literally the meme guys of the handshake thing with like the contract signed on the table, which is like, now that's standard for sports. Yeah, obviously that's standard, but back then that didn't happen. Like it would be like a news post, the person joins and say, I think that all helped too. Because one of the things we're getting to here, like you said about those statements you made, was whether people agreed, whether they thought it was ludicrous, that everyone had to have an opinion. In some ways, you actually were pumping the media side up in a way that didn't exist back then, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I went head to head with Midway in a famous gotfrag.com recording, and we remained really good friends for years and years after that. But at the time, we were butting heads because he was kind of known as one of the bigger personalities.
Yeah, he was like a Stephen A. Smith or something, if people don't know. He was kind of that type of a figure, right?
Yeah. So, he had me on the show and was coming at me, and I went right back at him. And at the time, it was a big deal. And yeah, signing Sean, I brought him over to my law firm, and signed a proper contract and took that picture in a conference room at the first location I had founded for my law firm. And yeah, at the time, I think it was a big deal. And I think in retrospect, some of the moves I made, you know, I hope on some level help professionalize North American esports. The reason I wore a tie was because I wanted to make a statement that this should be professional. This should be treated like a real business. You know, on the weekends, I didn't want to, when I go to events, the last thing I wanted to do was wear a tie, but it was very intentional. That picture was intentional. You know, making sure people knew that he signed a proper contract, that was intentional because I was trying to do my part to kind of raise and, you know, make the entire ecosystem a bit more professional than it was at the time because it was truly the Wild West back then.
If people go back to the original great call lineup that had the success from that winter onwards and eventually became world champions, etc., it's funny because the obvious big names are people like, I mean, actually, Sunman back in the day was a big player. fRoD obviously was a huge name. I would say the name I have to isolate immediately is just Warden, though, right? If you didn't start with Warden early on in those early, I don't think this lineup ever happens. By the way, his career wouldn't have gone the same way because he was one of those people, if people don't remember, who'd sort of like, I think people thought he was like a land choker or something because he'd gone to a CPL and done badly. He'd always been an invite level player. But as far as I know, because I saw him do this with the Forsaken team before yours, he was a guy that always knew who the good players were. And he actually has like a very, it's why I think he's suited to be a coach. He has like an interest in mind for like roles and how he can put, who is 100%. Warden to you? Because to me, he was kind of like one of the key pieces to pick, right?
100%. Like he was the first, I guess, true professional player that had more professional level experience that I ever brought in a complexity. We'd hired some other players, but that, like you said, they were more Cal M type of players. And Matt was the first real professional that had experience at that level. And I absolutely agree with you. He helped me construct that team, and his eye for talent was really unmatched in how the composition of the team should be. And he was a big reason we moved from Bullseye to Sunman. And that's really when we started having our breakthroughs. Yes. And there's a lot of intangibles in teams that don't necessarily get discussed in the public or well understood in the public. A lot of them happen behind closed doors. But you need a certain type of individual, at least one within each successful team. And I'm old school, so I kind of call it the fire in your belly. The hyper competitive, never say die person that keeps the team up during tough times, whether it's in practice or on big stages. And the intangibles of leadership and just hyper competitiveness that Matt brought were really, really valuable to the team. I mean, Danny was, in my opinion, the best player in the world at that time. And Sunman and Trip, both incredibly intelligent, talented players, but they're very kind of like reserved and very chill and just kind of laid back. So you need someone that fire in their belly, in the server, being like, you're down, you know, like 10-1 or whatever. You're like, no, we fucking got this. We're coming back. Like, this is not happening. We're going to battle. Like, you need that player on the team. The coach can try it. I can try it. But Matt was that guy. And he definitely helped me build out. And I strongly followed his advice on every piece of that puzzle, building what eventually became the best team in the world and the first American team to win on European soil at ESWC. So yeah, nothing but amazing things to say about his instinct, his experience, and absolutely want to give him a massive amount of credit for building that squad in the day.
It also shows how funny the industry is because the results can turn around in an instantaneous moment because the team went from like irrelevant / everyone's like, what a waste of time, to like top 4 at that major, fifth maybe, I think it was 5th at the CPL. Yeah. And then it was only something like 6 months later you won ESWC, like you say, when you made the one roster move. So even though you yourself always had to hype the angle, was it a surprise to you how quickly the success came? I mean, like we said, less than a year to be #1, basically.
You don't know, it really wasn't. When it actually happened, it's one of those surreal moments. You know, I was in tears and it was unbelievable. But, you know, I think part of being young is the one beautiful thing about being young is you have this naivete where life hasn't kicked you in the teeth that many times yet. And I was still, you know, a fairly young guy myself, and I had full confidence and I was just convinced that we were going to be number one in the world. No one was going to stop us, and we were just going to bulldoze our way through. So I was not surprised that it happened that fast. But yeah, looking back on it now as an older guy, it was a pretty special time, and I was blessed to work with the players that I did, and it was a hell of a lot of fun, man. Like, I miss IRC, I miss the GotFrag forums, and now we're all spread all over the place. We're on Discord and Twitter and Insta and TikTok. Like, the conversation is just all over the place. Back then, it was like IRC. You'd go into a team's channel after a big match, and it just was chaos. And you go to the GotFrag forums or the SK forums in Europe, and it was just a bit of a more innocent time, I guess, a simpler time, and in some ways, a better time in some ways.
As you say, obviously the marquee name was fRoD. I mean, he maybe was the best player in the world, the best AWP, all that jazz, right? I always think there's another angle where Cole doesn't get any credit. Bro, the second fRoD became the best, everyone could go, oh, he's obviously mega. The reason he had to be in complexity is people were squeezing him out of teams, and actually at the time, by the way, you know this, he was quite an unpopular pro player, actually, because the problem is he's a shit talker, and he's one of those guys who himself talked like he was number one before he was number one. And I can tell you, those old school people, the Motos and the people in those TDs, they didn't like people like that, mate. That's exactly the sort of person they desperately wanted to gatekeep out of the top level of CS. So once you had all the success, everyone could say he was amazing. But actually, the fact that he was sort of available for Cole to get shows like someone had to believe in this guy and invest in this guy and give him his spots and all the control, everything, right?
Yeah, I mean, we saw him on United 5, right? And we saw a lot of intangibles that we believed in. And you're 100% right. People think like esports and pro gaming at different levels is like an old boys club now. Shit, it's nothing now. Oh. It's way more open and merit-based. Back then, if you were like Danny, who didn't take shit from anybody, wasn't afraid to speak his mind and raise some hell, like you just all of a sudden you're not in an invite scrim on IRC.
Oh, if you're him, you're supposed to kiss the ring, bro. You're supposed to come to Rambo and kiss. Oh, you're so much better than me. You're supposed to do that back then, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's 100% true. And, I kind of likened him to the wild horses you see out in Wyoming.
Right.
Like some of the strongest wild horses. They're a little tough to get a rein on sometimes. But that was also kind of me at the time, too. So picking up Danny was obviously an integral part of our success. And I just saw him take over matches like the alternate attacks game in Dallas in 2006 when we had to come back and beat him twice in a row. There was just a couple moments where he just decided we're going to win, and he just single-handedly took over a match. I remember him on Inferno running into B site. He had an op, and it was a 2v2, and he was rotating, and they had two guys on the bomb site, and he just ran into the bomb site with the deagle and just domed both of them. Didn't even wait for his teammate to come over and plan the retake. He just decided that we were winning that game, and he was an unbelievably talented player. And part of me, like between you and me, I feel it's just the way life and history rolls out, but I feel like some of those early guys that were so unbelievably skilled, they were almost too early, right? Like they weren't paid what they should have been paid. They didn't get the 300,000 followers on their accounts because social media didn't exist. Like the guys that paved the road for people like me and many of us in today's pro scene, they did, I guess you could say that about any sport to some extent, right? Like in American baseball, they were making peanuts, and now they're making hundreds of millions of dollars in these contracts. But it was certainly true for the early guys that built the complexity brand. Like I look back and I'm like, man, I would, if they could have peaked in this day and age, if they could be a Donk, a Nico, whatever, an Elige in this day and age, they would have profited and been able to benefit a lot more. It's just kind of how history rolls out, I guess.
Thanks to the media statements you made when Call first was starting to get the players, obviously the main target in NA was Team 3D. They were the kings of NA. They used to win the WCG qualifier every year. They had the big salaries and the sponsors. So they had everything basically that you'd want to compete with. But I always thought the cool thing was even though you invested yourself money into them, you actually managed to make the classic storyline. It's why they made that like Game Boys thing, which it wasn't that great. Like, look, I would have done a way better job, but I get what he was trying to do. He was trying to do like a wrestling sports narrative around the two teams. Yeah. But the contrast was a good idea because it really was like that. It was the misfits and the cast-offs who were never going to be anything against like the royalty of fucking NACS. And actually they had the sponsors, you just had your money. And it kind of was a contrast to philosophies. I mean, if people don't even know, even though the teams played was like that, like 3D was like an all-star team that actually was sort of like didn't always even all fire on the same cylinders, but they had mad skill. Your team was the one where people actually think they didn't have enough skilled players, but the team play was amazing. The practice, I've also heard, by the way, Team 3 was one of those teams that just actually turned up and practiced and just phoned it in, you know, like, no, whatever, we're finished now. Do I get my money? Your team was the one that was trying to like never lose a scrim and was like dry running strats. It was kind of like it was almost like a movie contrast, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. They were the famous glory pretty boys or whatever. And I'm not saying that in a negative way. They were just incredibly popular. Yes. They had Intel, they had NVIDIA, you know, and my guys had me, right?
Yes.
And we had a chip on our shoulder. Damn right. We had a chip on our shoulder. Partially driven because we wanted to be number one, maybe partially, to be fair, maybe a little jealous. Like we won like three Cal I's in a row, and then this massive percentage of the fan base still loves 3D more. It's like we're beating them consistently, and you still love them more. So we always had a chip on our shoulder. We always wanted to knock them off the top of the hill, and I think it was very healthy for both brands. I think that storyline really fueled at least North American Counter-Strike and esports in the early days. And you know, the funny thing is, like, Craig and I were arch enemies. We laugh about it all the time. He was here for our 20th anniversary. I'm sitting in the headquarters right now, and we were just laughing about the old days, man. Like, we were doing anything behind the scenes we could to cut each other's jugular. And then we became friends after the CGS era, very close. And ironically, he introduced me to the investors that bought into Complexity and moved us to Dallas and built multi-million-dollar headquarters because we maintained that friendship. And it's just funny to look back on the waves of time and how things go, because if you had told me in 2005 that we would be really good friends and, you know, he would introduce me to one of the best opportunities of my life years later, I would have told you you're insane. But I guess the moral of that story is try not to burn bridges, even if you're hyper competitive with people. Like, leave the door open and try to treat people right, because Craig and his kindness definitely changed my life, my family's life in the past decade here. And but yeah, back in the day, it was cutthroat. And you know, after I got Bullseye, it was like gloves off. He was always coming after fRoD and, like, you know, trying to undermine things. And there was a funny story at ESWC the night before we were going to play in the finals the next day. I guess it gets SK. Yeah. Not the main. They had
the
two
Danish
teams.
one. Yeah.
Yeah. We were playing them for our first kind of world championship. And the night before, some guys from Team 3D were taking my players out, trying to get them all drunk and stuff, hoping that they would play like shit because they didn't want us to win the championship, which we did. Hungover, allegedly. I wasn't there. I was too busy working to pay all the damn bills to travel over to Paris for that event. But yeah, there's a lot of stories like that behind the scenes. And, you know, I still keep in touch sporadically with the Rambos and the Methods, and like Moto, I hear, is absolutely just crushing life up in the Bay Area. So it's fun to see these guys grow up, and, you know, some of them get married and they got kids running around. But yeah, those were wild days, man. I often wonder, like, do other sports have all this crazy shit in their early history? I can only assume they do. But, you know, I feel really blessed and fortunate to have been involved and to have seen esports so early. People are like, oh, you were a visionary, you're an early legend. It's like, man, nah, I got lucky, and my passion and competitiveness drove me into this industry, much to the harm of my own family quite often, you know, in that the hours I was working and the money that I was spending, and then I sold my law firm, moved to California, and they shut down the league, and I was unemployed in California. Like, I put my family through a lot harder times than we could have had if I had just done the traditional thing and stayed a lawyer and just kind of played out your, you know, retire at 55 and, you know, go to Florida a couple times a year. But that was never really me. So I feel really blessed that I've been able to be involved with esports all these years and work with the players that I have and the coworkers that I have and the leagues that I've advised. And I'll look back on this whole esports journey with a lot of humility and a lot of gratitude. But luckily, that journey's not over yet, because I'm still out here scratching and clawing and trying to climb back up the hill.
Along those lines, I did actually want to ask a question about the family topic you brought up, because I've always felt like that's actually the part that people forget about your story. I think they actually misunderstood, because I can tell you when you first came in the scene and you were spending the money on the ringers and this, people just thought, essentially, the joke is this exists now, but it didn't back then. You know, in like the early 2010s, I remember in Dota most famously, although I guess there was the guy Mortar in CS, there were some rich people from the Middle East who were like, you know, their uncle's a sheik or something, or they had like oil business, and there was guys who I know like paid like some of the old like NA Dota players to like fly out there, you know, like pay them like 15 grand, and you go out and you just play like solo queue with them or whatever, right? I think people actually naively thought that was you. They thought you were just some daddy warbucks who had money. They didn't realise that, like, again, look, relative to the scene, you were someone who had a lot of money. You had a very good job compared to in esports, because we were all doing it for passion off like 10 grand a year. But actually, you were just like a normal, like fucking middle class person at this point in time. Like, you were actually sort of like, you'd grinded up doing the job. And what I want to get to is this: what you invested was crazy. Like, look, even though I was there back then, I would have told you, you're never going to fucking see a return on this. You got your mind. Like, do it the other way around. Like, once you get a couple of big players, you know, spend less on the other guy and then min-max, then hope you can get a spot. Like, you actually went all out with it. So the reason why, it's a bit like I always say, I don't blame any pro where they had that story where their parents are like, what are you doing? Like, go to school. I'm like, bro, until you actually won the best, they were right. Like, what if it hadn't worked? Like, what if you'd fucked your life up and you weren't as right as you thought you were? So if I'm thinking of your family, bro, first of all, that's a hell of a grind right there. Earning all the money doing law, by the way, one of the most boring subjects of all time, but you can make loads of money. It's, by the way, it's like chess. It's like the one of those competitive fields you could ever be in. Every fucker's trying to do that to get the money. So you get the money with it, and then you turn around and chuck it into video games. Like, if I was your family, I would be like, bro, is this a midlife crisis? What are we doing here? Like, you are aware if this doesn't work out, like, that's like, that was our nest egg. That was the house. That was the kids' college funds. 100%. I'm sure this was real, right? I'm sure there was a pressure like that, right?
100%. Like, I was already working as a lawyer 50, 60 hours a week. I was scaling my law firm into 5 areas around the city. And I was plowing all my profits into complexity, in addition to adding, 20, 30 hours a week on my quote unquote side hustle. And, so there was never any margin, because if I had a good month or a good quarter, maybe I could have set aside, 150 grand, 200 grand, whatever it was. It was all going into complexity, all of it. And there was actually a point where the real estate economy started to cool. And this was leading up to the 2008 real estate crash. And I was a real estate attorney. And there was a point where I had to decide if I was going to send the team. Number one, we were going to ISC, Intel Summer Challenge, which was a successor to CPL, which I mentioned earlier. And then we were going up to San Francisco for the Championship Gaming Series Invitational. Sure. And to send the team to that event was going to cost me like $5 grand. And at that moment in time, and any entrepreneur can kind of relate to this, because these things come in waves. At that point in time, I was completely broke. I had so much going on. I just opened 2 more offices. Business had been slowing with real estate. I literally had $5,000 my name. And that $5,000 was supposed to pay my mortgage on my house. So what did I do? I used that $5,000 to send the team to Dallas. They won in Dallas. The next weekend, they went up to San Francisco and won again. They won $50,000 in prize money, and my cut was $5,000. And I paid my house payment. People don't really hear about that stuff. No. They hear about all the legends and all this, but no, you're 100% right. I was an entrepreneur trying to build a business, which was my main job. At the same time, I was self-funding complexity. So you look at that from any rational standpoint. It's batshit crazy. The fact that my wife has stayed with me all these years through the ups and downs of esports really is a testament to her. My kids were too young back then to know that daddy was going all in and all in and all in again at the poker table of life. But Yeah, it was a wild ride, and thank God, and certainly my wife for helping me survive it.
Because to me, this is the part about the CGS part of the story that I notice everyone asks you about that, but they never get this part of the context, which is I remember quite famously in that documentary that was about you. At the end of the documentary, it was supposed to end on a high, which is like the same story we just told was supposed to go. And in the end, along came CGS and everyone got salaries and got bought out, and it was happily ever after. And you even say in this documentary, basically, if it doesn't work now, esports just isn't going to work. You actually just like straight up say something to that effect. And for you especially, this is the key point. People like Torpal ran Team 3D as a business, mate. They got enough money through the sponsors. They had enough placings. They already had the good players. They were able to make it just about work and pay themselves a salary. You just invested, like we say, essentially all your actual income from the rest of your life that wasn't going to your family went in this business. For you, this at the time had to feel like it's this or bust, right? If this doesn't work, then what was that all for? Like, what did I put all the money in, right? I'm sure the pressure
100%.
was huge.
100%. Yeah, I famously said if this doesn't work, then esports is dead. And after it crashed, esports was
That's what it felt like. Yeah.
For quite a while. But yeah, I mean, people are like, why did you sell Complexity to DirecTV? Like, why'd you do that? I'm just like, at the time I was paying my guys $1,000 a month salary each. I had to shoulder all the travel. I was paying.
By the way, one thing everyone forgets to mention is travel was way more expensive. There wasn't like Southwest Airlines and all these low-cost airlines. Bro, just to go to a CPL from LA was like $700 or something, right? It was big-time money.
Yeah, it was brutal. The travel was a minimum 100 grand.
I bet Europe was insane to go to from America back then. It would be like thousands each, right?
Yeah, and the leagues weren't like subsidizing.
No, nothing. You used to pay everything.
Back then, nothing. And then, you know, DirecTV, a news corporation, this global satellite network comes in and they're like, we're going to pay everybody $2,500 a month and we're going to put you on TV all summer. So it's just like, A, I couldn't financially compete with that. B, I would never want to, you know, try to pull the contract prison type of thing and prevent my players from what could be the opportunity of a lifetime that they'd worked really hard for. So it was really get on the CGS bus or just leave esports. And I had definitely debated both, but they cut me a good deal with a lot of future revenue streams and profit sharing and things. So sold Complexity, and now I'm running a law firm in Atlanta and running the Los Angeles Complexity. So I'm working all week in Atlanta, and I'm flying almost every weekend out to Los Angeles, which, as you can imagine, with a wife and 2 young kids, was challenging to say the very least. You know, and the thing was, and I try not to disparage too much of the project because there were good people with good intentions behind it, but it wasn't far into the first season where I was sitting with some executives of the league and they're talking about how they're going to do this, and I'm just like, we're fucked. I knew fairly early on that if this is the direction they were going to take, it wasn't going to resonate with gamers and it was going to be a failure. They had the guy from the San Francisco Optics, Offbeat Ninja, running across the top of the apartment complex dressed as a ninja and just stupid shit like this. Just like, oh, this would be great on TV and these skits and all this. And I'm just like, no, man, like this isn't it. This just isn't it. And we're working hard to try to right the ship. And those of us that kind of came from esports before then, yeah, but I'd moved my family out to California. I'd sold my law firm, and we did that in May of 2008. The global economy collapsed that summer, and they shut down the whole global league a week before my wife's birthday in November of 2008. And that point, and I've said this before, my beautiful, wonderful wife, in a moment of frustration, looks at me and says, "What have you done with our lives?" And that's a moment.
That would be a great scene in a movie. It'd have to be halfway through, obviously, but it'd be a hell of a scene, you know.
And then, you know, just when,
by the way, when you say that though, you say it now. Look, you go on.
When your viewer is saying there's no way this guy could be any more stupid than he's already been, buying motorcycles, spending all his money, spending his mortgage payment to fly his gamers to Dallas, hoping they'll win prize money. You know, I remember my father said to me, "You're finally done with this silly gaming thing, right?" And I said, "No, I bought back the intellectual property to Complexity a week ago, and I'm rebuilding it from the ground up." And he just looked at me, and he was not happy with me, let's just say.
When you say that, though, like, you can now look back and laugh. But in that moment, like when your wife turns to you, does that ever make you actually think, what have I done? Maybe I did do the wrong thing. Maybe it was the wrong move.
Yeah, 100%. I think anyone that doesn't doubt themselves at some point in life, or at least strongly question the decisions they've made, is not an introspective person, I don't think they will ever gain wisdom if you don't kind of analyze the situation. I certainly was very hard on myself during that period. It was a very difficult and dark period of my life. But luckily, the one thing I did get from my father was I just don't quit. I don't really understand the meaning of the word. So in the midst of one of the worst periods of my life, I set back to doing what I knew that I was good at, and that's working hard. And because when I got Complexity back, I had no staff, no players, no website, nothing. The famous Complexity forums that were big back then were gone. And I literally started Complexity back from absolutely nothing. And I remember those first 2 weeks, I was sleeping maybe 1 or 2 hours a night because I'd hired multiple coders and I wanted to get the website back online as soon as I could. And I was literally working 22, 23 hours a day for like 2 straight weeks and got that website back online. And those are stories, you know, that people haven't heard, or maybe they just don't care about. But sometimes when, you know, like the good things are happening and people are like, wow, like you guys have been around 20 years or whatever. It's like, that's because there's a lot of scars, right? That's why I got these ugly ass bags under my eyes. I'm a little jet lagged today too, but yeah. So those are the stories. Those are the reflections, man. I'm glad you've been doing this series. You've interviewed a lot of really fascinating people, and those are the stories that are what esports is really about.
Yes. Well, along those lines, go on.
Esports has gone through different iterations, right? None of them were perfect. There's been snakes and grifters and scammers at each stage, but I can testify to the fact there are good people in this business that have sacrificed because they genuinely love this space. And sometimes I think us OGs or whatever you call us, we can get frustrated with the next wave of this business or where it's funded or what corporations or what regions or whatever. But just know that there are still a core group of people around the world. And I do believe that core has continued to grow, that genuinely care about this space, that have sacrificed, that could have made more money elsewhere. They're not the grifters on LinkedIn. They're not the consultants saying they're experts or whatever. And I've been honored to know a lot of them, and you are certainly one of them. People that have been here when they could have done better financially in other places, that we are the foundational pillars of this industry. And like I said, I'm just really humbled and grateful that my name, I think, will be on that list when people look back 50 years from now. And it's just lucky that I chose this path.
Speaking of stories that people don't remember, they just don't know, we're right actually at a point in the chronology where everyone skips over this, and I know they just don't know the context, Jason. So there's 2 things happened when you got called back. As you said, everyone does this thing where they go, there was Complexity, he built it up, they were like #1 in CS 1.6, then they sold to CGS, yada, yada, yada. Anyway, CS goes here, he's got Sean gets it, whoa, you missed about 5 years there. And when you started over, the key point a lot of people don't know is obviously you had the same core of players from 1.6 in CGS in Source. You had fRoD and you had Warden and you had those guys. Yes, you brought in some of the 3D guys. But afterwards, when it was cancelled, CGS, the perception at the time actually was, right, well, if they're coming back to 1.6, he's going to get fRoD and those guys. And obviously, this is what happened. They went to Evil Geniuses. There's 2 details people don't know. One detail, and why this isn't known is mental, because the guy I'm about to mention is probably more famous than all of us. Alex Garfield, who was the EG guy, had himself been working for Call before that, and he used to almost do EG as his like bedroom project that was just like a little North American team, you know, canny little thing. It wasn't ever the massive monolith it is now of the Yankees or whatever it became. And then he was working with your team as like an assistant manager or a general manager or something. And then basically the perception at the time was, I even knew some of the players, so we can maybe get into some of that if you want. The perception at the time was you thought similarly to what I'm saying. It's like, right, well, if we're coming back to 1.6, boys, you know, let's figure out what we're going to do. And then they just basically told you like, oh, bad news. Like, we're going with Alex Garfield though. We're going to EG. And as far as I know, it wasn't even something insane. It was just like he offered them a little bit more money or something like that. Is the gist of this story right? Can you give me some background on it? Because it sounds like betrayal. I've got to say, it just sounds a bit like that, you know.
And at the time, it really felt like that. Like, you know, being, you know, hindsight being 2020, I look back on it and I'm like, you know, we'd been through a lot together, and I certainly hadn't always been perfect. I'd yelled at these guys, and we'd gone through a lot of shit together. But at the time, I felt like I was trying to help kind of mentor Alex while he was building his business and signing Intel and some other things. And obviously, me and the Counter-Strike guys had been through quite a bit together. So my initial feeling when everybody bailed and they're all running to EG, I definitely felt betrayed, and I felt it hurt me quite deeply. But when I look back on it later, it was very logical. It's like EG had done a good job building the foundations of what became America's biggest organization for years to come through the StarCraft era. They had stable salaries and you know, an experienced operator. And I had nothing, like I said, off the back of CGS. I was kind of just laying beaten and bruised on the side of the road. So they made an intelligent decision. At the time, it sure didn't feel like that. But over the years, like I've had conversations with them, and you know, Warden has worked here at Complexity for years after the fact. And even, you know, with Alex Garfield at the time, we definitely had a period of time where there was a great deal of animosity between us. And as time has gone on, you know, we keep in touch 2 or 3 times a year, and we've become good friends and confidants for each other. So I think you could kind of see a pattern in my life. It's like I get into these huge fights with these, and I have like arch enemies and things, but we always seem to circle back and actually be good friends and have deep relationships after the fact. So I don't fault them whatsoever. Looking back, I think they made the right decision. Everyone was a little shell-shocked when CGS died. We'd all just lost our livelihoods. It was a wild period of time. And yeah, I mean, I'm not exactly sure what else to say about that. That's a really, really good question. That was a very painful period that took some time to heal from and rebuild relationships. But I'm really happy to say that, you know, that has been accomplished, and I hold zero animosity towards anybody involved in that whole thing. And if anything, I assume my responsibility for screwing up lots of things during that time. See, one thing I don't think a lot of people know, and this is really going to be more transparent than the average person would be, but hey, you've known me for what, 20 years, this is the way I am, is during that time period where I was running the law firm and building Complexity and working literally like 90 hours a week, and then I was traveling cross country and everything, I acquired, you know, an addiction to alcohol, which was really beginning. You know, at first it became something that was a crutch, and then it became a problem. And there was times during that when I treated people while under the influence of alcohol much, much differently than I would had I not had that problem. I even had a drink now, and I lose track, 12 or 13 years. It's been a really long time. But during that time period, you know, I drank too much, and I was abusive and yelling at people and saying things that I shouldn't have. Not all the time, but enough to where, you know, I had a lot of apologies to make and a lot of amends to make off that period of my life. And I feel I've done my best to do that. And I've sought forgiveness from people that I didn't treat right, and learned my lessons, and walked away from it 100%. And I've tried to do better and deal with people better. It was a culmination of just years of partying and years of very long hours in an outrageous amount of stress. So when the guys at the end saw a paycheck and a stable organization while I had nothing, it wasn't just the money. It was, I think, on some level, like, hey, we just all need a break. We've been through a lot of shit. We've been in the trenches together for years, and so I don't fault them at all. And I've accepted, you know, where I was certainly responsible. I mean, like a lot of things, it goes both ways in different directions or whatever. But the adult thing and the wise thing to do is really own up to your shortcomings. Ask forgiveness from people for when you messed up, and then just try to do better. And that's something I've always tried to do, is really man up, accept when I mess up, seek forgiveness, and then try to never make the same mistakes again. And I think that's served me well in my life. You know, some people are going to forgive you, some people are going to hold grudges forever, and that's just the way it is. All you can do is improve, learn from your mistakes, improve, learn from your mistakes, improve, and hope the good Lord gives you additional wisdom. So when you get in critical points of your life, whether it be in work or family or relationships, that you can make better choices. And I'd like to think on some level that that is who I am now. And sure as hell far from perfect. But over the last like 5 or 6 years, I've seen a lot of decisions and things that I've done that I know I would have handled far, far worse. 2003, 2005, 2006. So that gives me some encouragement. I've learned to stay humble because I'll probably stick my foot in my mouth next week and get in trouble for something. It's just kind of my personality. But yeah, that was a wild period, and I'm very glad to say that, at least for my side, I have strong relationships with all the people that were involved in that crazy period of esports.
The reason why I wanted to bring that side up, though, is not actually to like sow some dissent against Alex Garfield and the players. It's because I feel like that side has never been told. And part of the reason why is what you've just addressed. Like, if people have ever watched my Reflections interviews, depending on what year in the last 10 years, some of the ex-call people were a bit more bitter, or they had resentment, or they were referencing things they couldn't say, like you just referenced. Like, I've heard all the stories, mate. I knew all these people. I was friends with some of them, so I knew some of them thought things like this. When this move happened, their perspective was pretty ruthless, bro. Their whole thing was sort of like, well, look, you know, we didn't promise him anything. We just pro players, you know, we're allowed to move on to another team. They made it sound like it was just a free agent thing, you know, like, hey, I just picked a different org. And then also they would do the same thing. You don't know, like, you used to get mad and shout at people or get angry or be unrealistic. And I used to tell them, like, this is the difference between doing an interview and doing a talk show. On a talk show, I get to talk next. I'd say my opinion. On an interview like this, I'm not interviewing politicians, mate. If they give their take, I have to just sort of live with it and go, right, next question. But what I've never been able to say to these guys publicly, but I've told them it privately, is, bro, you can't treat it like you were just working at a McDonald's franchise and then you decided to go work for Burger King. The guy literally took his actual real life job, which is the only reason your team could ever exist, sunk the whole thing into your team existing. By the way, you think along the way he couldn't have brought a player in from Rival to replace this guy who's not that great, or brought in some IGL, maybe more comes over and replace. He could have done that too. So to me, I think the only thing I will say is this: I do think they were a bit unfair. Like, they tried to treat it like, hey, you know, we don't have any ties to each other. But I would just say, like, guys, he did literally put his whole life into that team, though. Like, on some level, I know what you mean. I can see their perspective, but I could also see from your side, I'd be like, don't I get like a little bit, like a grace period? Don't I get something back for what I've put in? Like, I didn't just treat you like a normal org owner, right? I mean, back then when players didn't make money themselves, I think some of them naively think it did grow on trees and you just have a big bunch that you're giving out. Like, you were making that in your other job. Like, I think that's a valid perspective, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. And it hurt me deeply at the time. It messed me up a little bit. But, you know, they say time heals all wounds. And I certainly want to believe that I've owned my part of that situation. And I've sought forgiveness in the situation. And, you know, I certainly have forgiven them for whatever I felt I was wronged. And
would it be an unfair question to ask you? Because I'm sure you did hire these people because they were valid at their jobs too. But I noticed you did hire a lot of these people later in better capacities. Like, first of all, you had Warden as a coach GM. Like, he's good at that role, but you did certainly brought him back. By the way, you brought my mate Ronald Rambo back. I think he's a legend. He's one of the best players ever. Everyone forgot about this guy, mate. That was 10 years earlier. You brought him in as a coach for a while. By the way, even fRoD. You know what? I love fRoD, and I know that he feels like he was screwed over. Bro, I'd tell you this to your face. You never should have been in that lineup. Like, he forced you into the lineup, maybe out of, I don't know, trying to heal the wound. Was some of that part of also why you've tried to bring these people back to sort of, I don't know, even the ledger, make good, sure there was no hard fit? Was that something of why you've tried to keep using the same people?
I mean, I think it's because I greatly respected their skill sets and their experience. But B, yeah, I can be loyal to a fault. And, you know, I don't forget what people have done for me. I don't forget those memories. You know, 4 of us packed into a hotel room.
Oh,
you know,
sure.
because we couldn't afford another room. And I try to do my best by the people from the old days. Now, some people will be like, "Oh, look at you guys now," and da 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 da, and like, "I need a job," and they get mad at you or whatever. But when it makes sense, I try to do right by them. And obviously, in retrospect, us bringing fRoD back to play was not the right decision, but it wasn't done out of any guilt or even loyalty. I just seen him destroying Counter-Strike, and I believed that he could do it again. And so we made that move, and it was really obviously not working out. The other players were very angry with me, and then I let him go, and he was extremely angry at me, even though the other 4 players were about to fucking walk if I didn't. But yeah, I'm super happy for him that he's really built a nice coaching career down in South America, and he's got a family of his own now, and I'm real happy about that. But yeah, it is painful sometimes when people that you've worked with and you've tried to do right are constantly coming at you for different things. But it just is what it is. This is a life I've chosen, and yeah, from my side, it's all love and it's all good. And if I had something for any of these guys that made sense for our current situation and our current company, I would work with them again. And like you said, I've proven that multiple times over the past years.
Everyone needs a support network, and mine is, of course, my Patreon community, the Scrominati, who in many ways, they're the Sonny to my Cher, saying, "I got you, babe." So this video and all the others on my channel were kindly supported by the following names: Ahmed Hadju, Mac Pugnaccio Rakula, Adam Tomlin, Animosity, Jensen Go, Tosh, Toucan, and you know it. Jerky's Minion, my main man, always going to be referenced, one of the best patrons of all time. Would you like to ask a question in my AMA? Maybe you want to suggest a topic or a guest to say on my channel. Do you want teasers to find out who the upcoming Reflections and Talk to Thorin interviews are? Maybe you want to do one of those long discussions where you get to set the topics we talk about. Well, if any of these or others appeal to you, put your money where your mouth is. Join the Scluminati today via the Patreon link in the description box below.